Hi guys, hope everyone's okay. As a sort of prelude to me finishing off the forged feather pattern Damascus folding knife blade, which I'm actually going to do over this Christmas time. I'm going to finish them, at least one of them blades off. I'm going to show you how I set out the pattern for a folding knife, how you set out the spring and the mechanism. There's probably better ways of doing this, I am not actually sure, but this is just the way I figured it out in the end. So let's assume that is your blade, and this is the handle, or the liner assembly. And I always do it off card, or you can do it off plastic, perspex, whatever, but that's a piece of card. It's a little over an inch wide. It's normally about the width I'd use to set a knife out, and the first thing I do is I scribe a centre line in the card. Now the next thing you want to do, you want to gauge what the thickness of your spring is, and to all intents and purposes it's possibly going to be there. It may be a little more depending on what you want, how heavy you want your spring. We got millimeters on this, we have. So what's the set on that? Actually that's inches. Where's the mils on this damn thing? Hang on. 4 to 5 millimeter is a good depth for your spring. So what I then do is set the protractor from the centre line to where the base of my spring will be, and I need that to be right in the centre and touching there. Now what I need to do is come back another about 2 millimeters. So I draw that circle on there. Okay, now what I do is I go back to there and I draw in another circle on there, and obviously both them circles are going to meet at a point there. So this, the reason for drawing it twice is this: as the knife rotates on its pivot, and the pivot will be, is it that mark? Yes, the pivot will be there on it. So as the knife rotates on its pivot, we want the rounded section of the back to push the spring up by half its width. So if you end up with your spring being, let's say for example 10 millimeters thick, then you would extend that line out 5 millimeters, and that is half the spring's width is the tension you want on the spring when you're closing it and opening it. Have you got that? I hope so. So right, let us set out how long we're going to make the actual spring. I've never measured this, so because I've always kind of done it by eye. So looking at that, it seems to be about 15 millimeters, the section of spring that actually locks onto the blade, and that line wants to be canted back slightly like that, and this line wants to be canted up slightly like that, so that when your spring sits in the slot on top of the blade, there's clearance here on the end of the spring, exaggerated, if you know what I mean. So that's where we're at so far. Right, what I'll do is I will cut that out, and what I also do is where the rotation comes round to there, I always clip that back slightly there, and I'll show you why shortly. So I'll bring it off on a round like that, and then this this section here can just be cut round. We're not being precise here because I'm just doing this for the video. Now we can just nick that off there. So I'll do it with scissors. Missed that a bit. So there we have the body of the knife, the knife handle. So I'm going to set the knife pattern onto there, and I just bring it in, you know, probably 3/4 of an inch, an inch in from the end of where the steel is, because we're just marking out a template at the moment and we can refine other things later on. And then I need to pin that in there, but I've lost my nail. And that is our rotation point. And when that we can, at this point we can sort of set up how we want the knife to look. Now if you want the knife to be a nice sweeping top, which is how I like my knives to look when they're finished, I like a nice sort of sweeping arch on them. I'll stick a picture in here of a folder I've just finished. I see that's the nice sweeping back on that. So you would just tip the two like that, and then we can start marking out the spring then. Now we need to know what the blade length is going to be, and in the UK 3 inches is the is a legal carry, and I estimate that the blade is probably going to start at that point. The front of the body of the handle is going to be somewhere around there, so I'll measure from there 3 inches. Again, you can mark this out longer, but if you mark your blade out longer, you're going to have to make your knife handle longer, and 3 inches a legal carry in the UK. So the next thing I'm going to do is mark out the shape of my knife, and I generally come down that inch, about 1/3, just to put a nice sweep on the blade like that. And then I'll bring the front down as I want, generally somewhere around there. So I'm going to cut out the shape of the blade now. Now what we want to do is bring the knife down, and you will see that in the open position, that's where the top of the spring is going to be, obviously. I don't know if you can see on there. What we want is where the spring is sat, locked on top of the lock there. When we turn the knife around, we want this to also sit on the lock. So what we would have to do here, rather than grinding down the spring, we're going to have to take a little bit more out of there. You see what I mean? We want to cut that until we can see that line, which is around there. That's about right there, guys. Now if you can see, the knife is probably going to sit inside the liners somewhere there, but you can see that doesn't leave us much spring there. So what I will then do is I will take just a shimmer off there, so I can give a bit more body to the spring, and then I will kind of take that off there, just so I've got some spring, and that's probably around where my spring is going to sit then, somewhere there. Now what we can do is draw around the blade, bring that round, and you can see that's where the knife's going to sit in the lock. What we do is we take that up 2 or 3 millimeters and draw the line, so that is the shape of the spring, and it then leaves us clearance so that when we close the knife, the cutting edge isn't actually hitting the spring. And what we can also do to stop that is putting a little lock pin in there underneath the spring, which you can do inside the liner, so that when the knife comes up, it will hit that lock pin and it cannot go any further then. So we've got to that stage. I hope everyone's following this. Now I will shape the handle, and I'll generally just bring the back down somewhere around there. Again, it's entirely up to you, the shape of the knife. I'll generally bring that up there. Now I want to bring up the handle, the bottom of the handle, and I will, just as an example, I will bring this round here, and then I will put a nice, somewhere there, a nice sweep into that. So I put that in the lock position now and mark this off. So mark that off there. That's a knife in its closed position. So we can bring that down to that point and then take the sweep off there. See where I'm getting at now, fellas? So we cut that out. We want to round the front of that off there. Let's go to that point. Let's put a nice sweep on that. Cut that down. I'll come off that point there. And you see, put our mechanism in together again. And when I make the knife, obviously that is going to be the spring, which I'm going to bring down to there. That will be the spring, which will be pinned usually around there, and sort of in the centre of that, around there, which is, it's around 2 inches back from the actual contact point there, because that will give you a nice bit of springiness on your blade. And if you can see now that point, it's halfway into the spring, so that from the locked position, as you rotate it, it will push the spring up, and then as you're closing the knife, what the spring obviously wants to come down, and it's pushing on that little heel there, so it will snap the knife back into position. And the thing about just bringing that shoulder out slightly is that is the point where you want your spring to contact. So there's our blade, there's our handle or frame. I'll give you a few construction tips if I can help. It's at this point I will put the liners, I will cut the liners to shape to my pattern, and I will either super glue them together or solder them together so that they're both locked, and I'll place them down on the board. That's the spring there. The spring's just been placed on top of the liners. And when you make your spring, just leave a mil or two on the bottom of the spring so that you can fit it. So you want to, obviously, as I've said before, you need to fit it so it just sits perfectly on there with that heel just touching, a slight gap there, slight gap there. And when you close, you want your spring to just sit perfectly on the bottom, so that when your knife is in the closed position, your spring is sitting exactly at the same place as the open position. And that's why I always leave a little bit on the bottom of the spring, so I can fit it just perfectly to there. What you do not do is, once the spring is fitted in that position, you don't grind any more off the spring. If you come round closed and your spring drops down, then you've taken too much off that point. And guys, there's no way of fixing it then. The only thing you can do is you'd have to grind some more off here and then drop your spring down and then grind your spine to meet your spring. So I mean, generally when I make one, I always leave at least 2mm on the top of the spring there, because at any point you can grind that down to your spine. But if you haven't got enough, it means you're making a whole spring when you come to fit it. So that's why I say leave a mil on there, just to allow for fitting. And when you've got that dead right, you know, you're right, and you can put your pin in there, your lock pin in there, or your lock pin just at the back of that heel there, where it doesn't interrupt anything. Just say there, a little lock pin there, or a little lock pin in there. It won't affect your spring, and it won't affect the blade. Once you've got all that done, you can then heat treat your blade, do the grinding on it and everything. Heat treat your spring. The springs, let's say this is an 01 knife, the spring will be tempered back, will be heat treated and then tempered back to around about 45 Rockwell. That's a good tension for a knife spring. I generally use a 5mm pin as a pivot pin. What I also do is I use these little oilite bushings, which are 5mm internal and I think 8mm external, and I use them to fit. So I drill an 8mm hole into the actual blade itself, and that is what the oilite bearing sits in. And to get me spacings each side of the blade, I use some of this brass shim, which is, don't ask me how thick it is, it's just thin. I then put a brass shim each side of the blade, and the oilite bush locates it dead in the centre of that, and then your liner will trap. Well, your liner will sit between the brass shim and your blade, just giving you that little bit of clearance, so that when you're opening and closing, your blade doesn't get too marked up, you know, scratching on the actual liners. It just gives you enough clearance. And that's it, fellas. So I've done this in response to people who've asked me for templates for folding knives, and I say I don't really have a template, because each folding knife I make, I go through the same process again, because I like to make all my folding knives slightly different, although they're all based on the same principle. But using this method of spring fitting, the actual blade shape, the handle shape, you know, it can be anything you want. I hope it helps some of you out. The Damascus folding knives, I'll give you a sneak preview. I've got one somewhere. The Damascus folders, finally got the steel etched out, ground to shape and etched out. Just done a very light etch on them. Yeah, and these will be 3-inch legal carry folders, these two knives. Slightly different thicknesses. One's about 4.5, the other's just under 4mm, I think. And then over Christmas I'm going to get these two, at least one of these knives finished. I'll go through the same process on both, making the springs, making everything else, and then I will actually just work on one and finish it off, then go back to the other one. Hi guys, Merry Christmas. Might get another vid out before Christmas, I'm not sure yet, but I will see you in the next one. Okay, bye for now.